Welcome to Season 3 of the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm your host, Derval Barzey, bringing awareness to climate change and sustainable development from a Caribbean perspective. Connecting you to sustainability solutions as we move from awareness to action. Today's special guest is an architectural designer with over 8 years of experience in a wide variety of projects throughout the Caribbean and the UK. She is a LEED Accredited Professional in General Building Design and Construction, Residential Homes, and a LEED Green Rater. With a Master's in Structural Engineering and Architecture, her multidisciplinary background and specialization in building information modeling fosters her passion for designing and delivering architecture that tells a story of consideration, environmental consciousness, energy efficiency, and resilience. When she is not in the studio, she is somewhere in nature or underwater exploring the deep blue. I am excited to welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, Ms. Alyssa-Amor Gibbons. Hello, Alyssa-Amor.
Hi, Derval. Hello, how are you doing?
I am good. How are you?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me. I'm very excited. You are the first architect I've had on the show.
Wow, that's awesome.
So tell me, what led you down the pathway to sustainability? Was it a defining moment or a gradual awakening?
Well, I think for me personally, my backgrounds since, childhood and throughout my academic life has always been a bit multidisciplinary. So, I come from a background in structural engineering, architecture. I've always been involved in some kind of environmental awareness as well. So as I progressed through my career, the synergies that I started to see developing between, environmental design, architectural design, how to make a building as efficient and perform as best as it could, those synergies really started to jump out at me. And, we are, in a decade that is pretty much categorized and defined by climate change. I think it's imperative that within any industry that you're in, these kinds of conversations about how we impact the environment naturally lead you to want to improve the way you go about your craft.
Yes, and you mentioned the defining decade for climate change.
Yes.
So what role does design and architecture play in achieving sustainability and climate resilience?
Well, just off the top of my head, if you look at statistics, the built environment contributes between 36 to 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's already a pretty high contributing factor. And when you start to take into account not just the way the building consumes energy, but also all the stuff that goes into it, from sourcing the raw materials to make different products, different building materials. There's a huge embodied carbon footprint within the built environment. You're literally looking at empty spaces, empty lots of land, sometimes previously developed lots of land, and trying to figure out how best to shape that space, how best to integrate with nature. So I think the built environment, and not just architecture and civic or even residential spaces, but the infrastructure that we need to put into servicing these buildings is significant. So it's definitely a very huge contributing factor to, the whole energy conversation.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you broke down the concept of the built environment, because I'm thinking from the perspective of maybe as a homeowner or even a business getting into construction, what are some of the things that are the priorities that we consider in the average homeowner? Do they consider energy, raw materials, carbon footprint, land use? Do we really include that in our considerations of the built environment?
Yeah, we should. We definitely should. Any designer that you have on board, they'll start with site analysis, taking stock of all the contributing factors to the site, whether it be orientation to sun, wind paths, rainfall across the site. That is really the initial design starting point, right? And what you said there just now, the last one you mentioned, land use, that's really where it starts from. Is about thinking, how do I do or have the least impact almost on this site? How do I do as little harm as I can to this site? So for the average homeowner, you may or may not decide to engage a professional. You may decide to skip the designer and go pretty much straight to drawing and contractor stage, where you're actually constructing the building. Even so, I think as the homeowner, you really get the best out of your finished product if you consider those factors in the beginning, right? It's estimated that you can reduce by about 20% the amount of energy consumption of your building by sticking to those basic principles, orientation to sun. If you consider things like passive ventilation as opposed to mechanical ventilation, you could really reduce and set your building up for better performance just by considering those simple things right off the bat and not waiting until, you start to pour concrete to realize, maybe we could have done this a little better,
Yes. Alyssa, what does it mean to be a LEED accredited professional in general building design and construction?
Great question. Thank you for that. LEED stands for Leadership in Environmental and Energy Design. Is pretty much a North American-led international certification for sustainable design. But what it means is that there are certain principles and intents that really look after how we go about building in the environment. And when you are a LEED AP, a LEED Accredited Professional, it means that you have gone through the process of really researching and studying all the different ways in which your building can perform more sustainably, right? And I'd say the kind of governing intent behind these types of accreditations is really obviously green design and green architecture, but reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, reducing carbon footprint, and lowering global warming potential of buildings. So when you see someone that's a LEED AP, it means that they can take your design process to that next level of ensuring that you can certify your building to certain metrics and standards that qualifies it as a lower consuming property, basically. So there's a range, basically. And at the higher end of the range in terms of performance is really net zero plus. So you're talking about a home or a building that, consumes less or as much as it produces of energy, or contributes more than it consumes. So if you're thinking like a good example would be PVs, photovoltaic cells, it means, for example, that your home is contributing more electricity than is consuming, right? And if you look at a LEED AP, it means that throughout the design process, we're able to take your home from one that perhaps was not designed with those metrics or those opportunities or those synergies in mind to one that ticks all the boxes of what we might consider now in the industry as a high-performing or sustainable home.
So in your experience, is this LEED accreditation becoming more common within the Caribbean or in Barbados?
I'd say yes. At the moment, I believe I'm the only person in the country that holds the LEED AP in homes for residential, and perhaps even the territorial Caribbean region. But even locally, our energy policy now, as we move towards the goal of being the first island state to be net zero by 2030, our government is seeking to implement, strategies such as LEED to help us make that transition. So I'd say definitely LEED is probably the most well-known across the globe. And I do see more and more governments kind of using that as a benchmark to help guide them in terms of the different approaches that we could take. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned a concept that I'm very interested in, but I'm more familiar with it as it relates to energy, and that is net zero. Mm-hmm. I'm very happy to hear that it also applies to the built environment.
Yeah, definitely.
It is also a strategy that will assist Barbados in achieving its ambitious target of becoming carbon neutral by 2030.
Yeah, definitely. I think with the whole net zero concept is a very interesting one when you apply it to architecture or the built environment, because people always get a little bit confused when you say net zero, like what is net zero, and I always challenge my clients and, the teams that I'm working on to not just consider net zero as the goal, because net zero means, like I said, that you are producing as much as you consume. So if you think of net as a trade-off, at the end it balances itself out. No, that does not mean that you are not wasting electricity or wasting energy. It just means that you're producing as much as you're consuming.
You're just balancing it, right?
Exactly. And quite frankly, you can still be consuming quite a bit. It doesn't mean that you're being energy efficient. You can still be generating a lot of carbon, So net zero, I think, is great, but I always caution people to remember first that you need to reduce and be efficient, right? I think that's super, super important, and that has to come first, because it does not make sense for us to be, reaching and striving for net zero, but still over consuming.
You just dropped a big gem there. Because net zero is a big buzzword now, particularly in the energy sector.
Yes.
And well, to me, it seems as though we think that's going to solve all our carbon emission problems, when actually we might just be putting a band-aid over a festering sore.
That's right. That's right.
While yes, it's one of many strategies, I think the danger is diverting attention and resources and efforts away from efficiency and energy transition by just focusing on zoning in on net zero.
Exactly. And I think too, what people, and I'm speaking particularly from an architectural point of view, what people don't realize is that a high percentage of the buildings that are going to exist by 2050 are already built, right? So there is a huge stock of existing buildings that will be repurposed, whether it is old warehouses that no longer have the manufacturing need and they need to be converted into, say, work from home spaces or office spaces. There's a huge stock of outdated and obsolete buildings that, quite frankly, it will cost probably a lot of money to either demolish, which, you try not to do that, and equally or more money to convert them to usable spaces that, are fit for purpose for our needs in this century. So net zero for those buildings is going to look completely different, because you may, your client may not want to totally retrofit the building to a spanking new facility. They might reuse the existing envelope that, may be old brick from centuries ago. So net zero for different types of building as well is going to look different.
My background is in risk management, and one of the risks I think that regardless of what sector you're in, you cannot escape is climate risk. And particularly here in the Caribbean, as you know, we're currently in the hurricane season and we're seeing more frequent and more intense tropical systems developing. And I think the expectation is at least one Category 5 hurricane to develop each season.
Yeah, I don't even know how. I mean, Barbados, we have not had, a major event for quite some time. And I don't know if it's I don't want to say luck. There's a local joke that God must be Barbadian because the major systems always seem to
Oh,
miss us.
you all say that too because
Yeah, we say that too.
we claim God as a Trini.
Yeah, you see, everyone thinks it won't happen to them, and we've been lucky. Neighboring islands not as much, but one I don't even want to say is a positive for islands that have suffered devastation before and in recent times. Looking back to Hurricane Maria, as well, but they have gone through it and had the opportunity to rebuild. So they've learned lessons that we have not learned and have not had to come back from. So I shudder to think what will happen when, or if, I want to say if, let's say if a Hurricane 5 category hurricane passes us. I don't know how much of us will still be standing. I mean, Hurricane Elsa just passed us, and she was a tropical storm that just upgraded, quite quickly to a level 1 hurricane, category 1 hurricane. And we lost or had, severe damage to over 2,000 plus homes. And that was a relatively minor system. So I think looking to the future, this whole concept of building back better, sustainable design needs to also consider resilient design and, quite frankly, just safe design, because I don't quite think we're there yet, unfortunately. We're just not.
Yeah, that's a major challenge within the region. And when you think about systems that have occurred like Irma, Maria, Dorian, and even most recently Elsa, it really emphasizes the importance of, as you said, designing with efficiency and resilience in mind.
Yeah.
And especially as small island developing states where, we have a huge burden of debt. And at the same time, trying to achieve our sustainable development and investing in much needed infrastructure, it should be from a point of view of ensuring that that investment is sustainable, is resilient,
Exactly. I am really glad you said that. I'm really glad you said that, because I think oftentimes we look at the quick fix and we fail to look ahead for what that might mean, even a decade down the road. Even our ambitions to be where we want to be by 2030 is 2021. That's less than a decade away now. It's great to have those ambitions, but we need a plan to get there. It's not just going to happen. And we can't wait until the last 2 years to be scrambling either. Things are going to get increasingly more extreme climate-wise. So just applying the quick fix solution, sometimes you might hear the legislative talk, but we actually need it to be implemented. We really do, just for basic safety and shelter,
Absolutely. Hearing our conversation, I know some of our listeners might be thinking, is sustainable building design and construction accessible to everyone, or is it a luxury item?
Another great question there. I think the misconception is that it has to be expensive. It does not at all. If you look at statistics again, and I always refer to statistics because it gives you a good example of facts, I've seen statistics that claim the energy use within buildings, the majority of energy used within buildings comes from heating and cooling spaces, right? Probably as high as 28% of the 36% contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Some bodies quote as high as 28% of that 26% comes from heating and cooling spaces. In the Caribbean, we don't have to rely on heating spaces at all, right? So automatically that sort of gives us an advantage, because at worst, we need to worry about, ventilation and cooling. So that takes a huge load off of our requirements right there already. And our Caribbean vernacular, our architectural vernacular is already well suited to the environment. You know, we're talking louvered windows, high clerestory openings, the passive ventilation, deep verandas. That's all stuff that we already do that contributes to good sustainable design. It does not mean that you need to kit out your house with, expensive add-ons. Something as simple as using LED bulbs, something as simple as installing an electricity meter so people are aware of their consumption. You cannot manage what you do not measure. They're just simple little things that you can do already to start reducing your carbon footprint, to start improving the efficiency of your building. There is architecture out there that is very beautiful, is very technologically sound, high level of design, strategy, technology, yes. But for the average person, and we're talking more so residential, it's not impossible for you to have a very well-performing building just by simply having a good insulated envelope, good orientation to sun, and some kind of low-impact development when it comes to harvesting rainwater and passive ventilation. It's not impossible, and it does not have to be expensive.
That is excellent news. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the Magnificent Seven, which are buildings in our capital city of Port of Spain that have been preserved or restored to maintain the historical architectural heritage. And they serve as an ode to our colonial past. And to me, they appear to have been designed for our climate. And when you contrast that with contemporary construction, which has embraced modern designs and materials, sometimes these seem at odds with the natural landscape and also turn out to be major consumers of resources.
Yeah. It's tough. I'm not going to lie. It's tough as a designer because as a designer, I love creativity, right? But it also needs to make sense. And I think in the Caribbean, we have a particular kind of paradox where we want to grow, our economy wants to grow, and we're heavily dependent on tourism still. And there's a level of expectation of what the average tourist comes to see. Everyone wants to see view, right? In islands with a really small footprint, a lot of times now that's meaning you're going upward, right? So that starts to impact on the language. It's more of a money thing, straight up, You want the snazzier buildings. You want something a bit more luxurious. You want to be competing with Thailand and Hawaii and Singapore. You want to be drawing persons to your island, So I think that alone has had a really big impact on a lot of the architecture and developments that we have here in Barbados even, and I'd imagine is similar throughout other countries. Trinidad is interesting because compared to us, you guys are huge. And I could imagine the last time I was in Trinidad, I was in traffic for like 5 hours, no joke, and I was mad. So I could imagine, as your economy starts to boom as well, and you're looking for high density housing in cities and stuff like that, that your architectural language is going to start changing just to meet those needs as well. But what's important as designers now is that you listen to the needs of the client, but you also really have to push for your principles and push for what you consider to be good design for long term as well, right? It's one thing to be building superstructures now and, sweeping villas across like the coastal landscape, but it all comes down to what is this doing to the environment. In cities, like you discussed, something as simple as heat island effects, where you have now so much hardscape, so much rooftops, so much road and pavement that it actually starts to create a microclimate in the city, and is actually 1 to 2 degrees higher than it would have been elsewhere, right? And people don't always clock that. So here we are changing essentially this micro environment. So now you have to cool it more. Now you need more wind flow. Now you need more
energy.
More energy, exactly. So we always have to challenge ourselves. Okay, if these are the requirements now, right? If these are the requirements now, if I need to find a way to house, clothe, bathe, provide shelter for maybe 20% more citizens, how do I do that in a way that still does not sacrifice the performance of the building and does not do unnecessary harm to the environment and have potential knock-on effects down the line? You know, designers, we are problem solvers. And I think we just need to go the extra mile to make sure that we're factoring in all of the issues before we come up with that final design solution.
You made some great points there, Alyssa-Amor. And I see the dichotomy right here between the two islands of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad, which is a bit more industrial in nature. Mm-hmm. You know, it has that industrial finish, I would say. And Tobago, which is more tourism oriented, they have retained a bit of that island vibe. As you mentioned, in our pursuit of development, or that imported model of development, what are we losing? What are we sacrificing? So I'm always a proponent of defining development on our own terms.
Yeah. There needs to be a social aspect as well. So it's not just, physical or infrastructural. They're sustainable, but also social, for sure.
And also integrating the built environment into that model.
Mm-hmm. I was reading an article the other day in an online paper here, local paper. I won't say the name of the paper. I won't say the name of the person that wrote the article. But there were discussions around, Bridgetown, the city here, and what it needs to be. What it needs to be like a 24/7, city vibe, where you have like high rises and housing and condos.
Like little New York, little Times Square.
Something like that. And do not get me wrong, I am all for progress. And there are some times where, there may be local kickback for some projects. And to me, the actual idea is not a bad one. It's just poorly executed and probably overlooks some of the more nuanced approaches that could have been taken, right? But my challenge with this particular article was it really highlighted the mindset that, some developers have towards development. And I can't remember exactly the wording, but basically the quote was that, we just need to lay the first brick and we just get going. And that is not how we do it. You can't just start and figure it out as you go. You need to think of, okay, how am I zoning this? What's the impact on how I master plan this cityscape?
Yeah,
you can't just start with one building, knock it up quickly, and then think, okay, then we're going to get investors and we're going to get some funding in, some money in, and then we could do the rest. No, you cannot go about it like that. You really can't. That's just asking for trouble.
Yes, because then you have natural and man-made disasters unfolding with extreme consequences.
Exactly. Not to mention the people that will have to be displaced to, make that a reality,
As we are on the social impact, I think often the influence of the built environment on human health is often underplayed.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
You getting into a real passion topic for me here. I don't know if I mentioned it to you. It's quite recent. I am also a WELL AP. WELL is not an acronym, but I think the name captures it all. It's about the wellness of the occupants of a building. And I think kind of what brought me to architecture, quite honestly, was learning about, our ancestors, African ancestors, their structures, how they literally carved buildings out of the earth. And it was so in tune and in one with nature. That's something that resonated with me so much because I really feel if you're going to do something, it needs to be a holistic approach. And you cannot make a space for someone to be in without considering how that space is going to impact that person, right? Human-centric architecture is super, super important because otherwise, why are you even bothering to build that space? Why are you bothering to build that home? Why are you bothering to build that school if it's not going to have a positive impact on the persons that have to occupy that space?
Wow. As you describe it, it makes a lot of sense, but I'm just thinking that I don't think that's how we design construction currently.
Not always,
Yeah.
but it's usually capital led,
Yes.
and I think we really need to fall back on the why. Why are you doing this? Why are you building the school, for example? It's not just to, tick a box on some like political ballot, It's about the education of our kids, our future. Like there's always a deeper why behind something, and that is something that I hold really close to my heart as I go about designing.
There's always a deeper why. I like that.
Yep, definitely.
And as you mentioned, human-centric architecture. You're probably familiar with the concept of earthships.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I've been observing that online. Well, I discovered it recently as I delved into sustainability. And I found that was so cool. I don't know if any exist in the region, but we probably have our own version of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I'd say on the South American countries that are considered Caribbean, maybe Belize and maybe even Guyana, Suriname. But there are some places here that use kind of pot clay construction technology for small follies like outdoor saunas and some of the eco villas here. They do, kind of handmade, back to nature construction methodologies as well.
Yes, I actually saw one in Freeport, Trinidad, where they build the bricks out of clay and the vetiver grass.
Yes.
And I find it fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially when you think about the cost of conventional housing today.
Yes. And it's good for the embodied carbon of the building, because if you say you have a site and you need to excavate the site to build there, imagine being able to say that you've used the materials that you've taken out of the land to sequester carbon within the building itself. That's awesome,
Yeah. Can you take us through some of the key benefits of building with energy efficiency and the environment in mind?
Well, I think from our entire combo, the most obvious one obviously is, reducing your carbon footprint. But I think and we're talking both residential, whether it be civic buildings, commercial buildings, I want to say the biggest benefit, I'll start with the human-centric aspect like we just talked about. If you were getting adequate natural daylight into your building without sacrificing the energy efficiency of the envelope, means you're not letting too much heat, or if you're having a conditioned space, too much of the coolness of the room out, that's a huge advantage, because it means that if it's an office building, happier employees. If it's home, it means that you're getting more like natural sun into the building. If you're able to open a window and get some fresh air rather than having to turn on a fan, and that has a positive impact on your utility bills, that's also a benefit. So you're talking about just the human aspect of feeling a sense of wellness in the space. That's one positive impact. Improved energy performance that you can actually see in your utility bills. That's another important factor as well. What people talk about a little less, but is becoming more of a talking point, is the opportunity to sell electricity as well, and perhaps make some income by selling electricity back to the grid in a net metering situation, or selling it to another consumer if you have your own PVs on your roof. Water in Barbados is a huge issue. We are, last time I checked, I think like the 11th or something like that, water scarce country in the entire world. I personally, my water goes off every other day as scheduled to help conserve what's in our reservoir. And, something as simple as having water storage systems, and I'm not just talking a tank, but some kind of rain and storm water management system where if there's heavy rainfall, that you're actually able to use that water. That's a huge one for us in Barbados, and I think is going to become increasingly important for us throughout the region as well. The ability to self-sustain I personally think moving forward that, especially with homes and after having to deal with COVID, in the last 3 months, we've probably gone into and out of curfew about 2 times, and we're back onto the curfew now. We've had volcanic ash turn our skies from sunlit to dark, and we do not even have a volcano on the island. We've had a hurricane. We've had an earthquake offshore. I think as the climate gets a bit more extreme, we are going to have to shelter in place, quarantine a lot more as Caribbean citizens. And I think a sustainable approach to the way we deliver our buildings will help us a bit more to be self-sufficient, whether it be integrating, like I said, water storage and management, even food gardens and provisions for people to be able to live a bit more off-grid, and I say that in air quotes. I think those simple strategies would definitely be hugely beneficial to us as we move into, I think a new era, a new climate era that we will be experiencing things that we never experienced before. And for that reason alone, I think it is a no-brainer to start thinking as sustainably as we can.
Definitely. As we're thinking here, I'm thinking about the flooding that is currently happening in Europe. And when you look at the images and the destruction, we've had our hurricanes in the region. That kind of flooding is not far-fetched for our region. And
totally.
So it makes the issue of resilience so important. We cannot change our geographical location outside of the hurricane belt. The climate ball has already started rolling, and while we try to mitigate, we also have to adapt and also have to develop resilience, which is about bouncing forward,
Yeah.
And definitely sustainable design of our built environment is a critical component of that.
Definitely.
So I really want to thank you, Alyssa-Amor, for sharing with us and enlightening us about the value and also the feasibility of sustainable building design.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I mean, we've chatted a bit off air, and this is my passion. We're not here forever, but for the short amount of time comparatively that we will be here, I think we just need to step as lightly as possible and as respectfully as possible to, what surrounds us.
I love that. Step as lightly as possible and as respectfully as possible. Well said.
Thank you.
So how can listeners connect with you?
You can follow me on LinkedIn, Alyssa-Amor Gibbons. I am also working on my website, so you can start glancing in every once in a while to www.studio-amor.com. And you can also check us out on IG. The goal, I think, over the next couple of months is to really officially establish the company and set ourselves up to really do some great work in terms of sustainable consulting and green design.
Awesome.
And I hope I did it justice being the first designer on here.
You definitely did. Big shoes to fill.
Thank you for having me so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Climate Conscious Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter @The Climate Conscious.